Okay, let's start. Good morning, good afternoon, or night, wherever you are. We're meeting today in the last meeting for this term of the Tel Aviv University International Workshop. This special meeting is dedicated to remember, just please all mute yourself, or Eliav, you can do that. This meeting is dedicated to remember our friend and colleague Karen Knop and to celebrate her life and work. Karen was a Cecil A. Wright Chair at the University of Toronto Law School. She died on September 26 at the way too young age of 62. Karen was a leading voice in international law scholarship, monograph Diversity and Self-Determination International Law, published by Cambridge University Press, was recognized by the American Society of International Law with a Certificate of Merit. She was recognized around the world as a leading international scholar. She gave the Hague Lectures in 2020. In 2022, she was a Max Planck Fellow. In 2021, she was a visiting professor at Helsinki. She was selected to give the prestigious Lauterpacht Lectures at Cambridge University. And she served on the board of many journals, including the American Journal of International Law and its online companion, Aeyal Unbound. The University of Toronto's website describes Karen with precision as a brilliant, eloquent writer, an original thinker, and a generous colleague and teacher, always ready to share insight and provide support and mentorship. It also says, above all, Karen was a friend to so many of us and beloved by students to whom she was a dedicated mentor. She was full of ideas and a fount of knowledge on everything from art exhibitions to design to indoor plants to the best new restaurants. She was a brilliant conversationalist who never settled for the ordinary. All of us who knew Karen will agree. Karen was an inspiring colleague. Her original research and writing inspired so many of us and will continue to inspire. She was a generous colleague, always willing to support, to engage, to help. And we know that's not always the case. She was a friendly and fun colleague. And I think everyone that remember Karen will remember the fun that we always had with her, always fun to hang out with her and dine with her, be it in Toronto or New York, London, or here in Tel Aviv and other places. When I first suggested to Karen to be a guest of this workshop, it was in 2014, at a time during which it was hard for her to travel because of her father's failing health. We discussed the possibility of Skype. This is 2014, pre-Zoom. Instead, to which Karen answered by email, "You mentioned Skype, but I'm such a fan of the Invisible College at Tel Aviv, and it would be a shame to Skype and not to have the opportunity to spend time with you. So I hope you'll understand if I pass this time and hope there'll be another chance in the future." Fortunately, that chance occurred, but before I mention that, I want to say that Karen's invoking of the invisible college metaphor referred, of course, to Oscar Schachter's famous description of the community of international lawyers in his 1977 article as one that, though dispersed throughout the world and engaged in diverse occupations, constitutes a kind of invisible college dedicated to a common intellectual enterprise. Its members, he said, are engaged in a continuous process of communication and collaboration. And it is this college that Karen was such a prominent member of that was shocked when the news came in September of Karen's untimely death, and which continues to mourn her and remember her regularly. And through events like this one and similar events that, as far as I know, are held or being held or will be held shortly in Heidelberg, Helsinki, London, and Toronto. In the same article, Schachter describes the Invisible College as typified by a willingness and ability of most members to avoid compartmentalization and accept generalism. Now, I'm not sure if this may be true anymore in the era of fragmentation, but Karen was a unique combination of a college member who embraced generalism while still developing her own specializations and working also within the newer critical and feminist approaches to international law. As I mentioned, fortunately, 2 years after the attempt that failed because she did not want to do it by Skype, but wanted to come and spend time with us here, we did manage to have Karen visit us in person in 2016 when she was a guest of our international workshop, but also reflecting, her broad knowledge and interest. She was also a guest of our school's private law workshop and also of the forum on law globalization and the transnational sphere, which was active at the time. We had a great visit, and of course, great presentations. And I cherish the thank you email she wrote me later, where she praised not only the amazing visit and the fact that, in her word, everyone at Tel Aviv University is so smart and cool, but also my choice of restaurants, which she called fantastic. And if you knew Karen, you know how much that was important coming from her. Karen was one of the early writers on feminist approaches to international law, and one of the few public international lawyers who also ventured into private international law and to the relationship between the twain that almost never meet. She was a groundbreaking scholar of statehood, recognition, and self-determination. While nothing can fill the gap created by her loss, we wanted to honor her by continuing the discussion and engagement with her today in the workshop of which she was a guest and friend. Today, each of our speakers have chosen a piece by Karen from each of those three specialties to speak about. Fleur Jones from the UNSW Sydney will talk about early feminist work by Karen through the article Restatements, Feminism and State Sovereignty in International Law for 1993, which for me, like for many others, was the first encounters in Karen's work even before I met her in person. In fact, I read it together with Fleur in David Kennedy's international law class in 1995. Rob Howse from NYU will talk about Karen's work on self-determination through Karen's piece, Statehood, Territory, People, Government, from the 2015 Cambridge Companion to International Law. And Robert Y. from Osgoode Hall, York University, will talk about private international law through Karen's 2016 piece, Lorimer's Private Citizens of the World, which in fact was one of the papers she presented here at Tel Aviv during the visit which I mentioned. And finally, and I hope she'll be able to join us soon because she's speaking at another conference, Kerry Rittich from the University of Toronto, a colleague from the University of Toronto Law School, will add a few concluding words about being a friend and colleague of Karen. So without further ado, we are going to start with Fleur, and each of the speakers will speak for 10 to maximum 15 minutes. And Fleur, I will put the spotlight on you. Yes. And Fleur, thank you for staying up so late, Sydney time for us.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Aeyal. Thanks so much for the opportunity to remember Karen and her work with others. It's been a remarkable few months for all the kind of incredible outpouring of memories and appreciation and love for Karen, which has come from so many quarters across the field, which is really representative of the scholar that she was and the person that she was. As Aeyal said, I wanted to say a few things about this piece, Restatements, Feminism and State Sovereignty in International Law, that was published in 1993 in Transnational Law and Contemporary Problems, and then republished a year later in a book edited by Rebecca Cook called Human Rights of Women, National and International Perspectives. So it was published when Karen was 33 and was in her second year as a full-time faculty member at the University of Toronto, and 3 years after the award of her SJD. And if you haven't read it, it really rewards rereading. It is a dazzling piece, a kind of tour de force, and so kind of prescient of themes that and styles that were apparent throughout Karen's body of work. And I'll pick up a few of those. I first read the piece actually a couple of years before David Kennedy's, the class with Aeyal with David, in David Kennedy's international law class. I read it as an undergraduate in Gary Simpson's Current Issues in International Law class at the University of Melbourne. And Gary, I think, had seen it presented at Aeyal, I believe. And he was terribly excited about this piece. And as students, we all became completely captivated by it. It seemed to do so many things that other work we had been reading couldn't do or hadn't done. And again, as Aeyal said, I read it again as an LLM student in David Kennedy's international law class. So I met Karen through her writing, and it was only several years later when I went back to do an SJD that I met her in person and got to know her really over quite a long period, as in it took a while before we got to know each other well. This piece, this 1993 piece, is in so many ways, I think, vintage Knop. It is rigorous and yet irreverent, ambivalent yet uncompromising. It's deeply attentive to the work of every scholar that it deals with. No one is dealt with blithely. Everyone is dealt with care, and yet she is so clearly doing her own thing. It has a kind of radicalism by stealth. One of the themes of the piece is, in Karen's words, that emerging feminist approaches to international law have not yet challenged the deep structures of international law. And the piece leads readers to this challenge in a kind of spiral structure, revealing in a series of sharp analytical insights and logical sequences that feminist analyses may not lead where they claim to, and that feminist critique of the bounded state/self may yield perhaps perverse and contestable conclusions, including contested among feminists themselves, and that some feminist critiques remain wedded to the unity of state sovereignty and continue to work in and around it, even while claiming to go beyond it. And it was that Karen wanted to push a feminist scholarship and international law scholarship towards a more profound challenge of, as she said, the deep structures of international law. The culmination of this spiral, or one of several, was to suggest that feminist scholars might, quote, join, borrow from, or criticize existing debates in international law. And at the conclusion of the piece, she finds unlikely and unwilling allies in policy-oriented approaches of Lasswell, McDougall and Reisman, as she does in other international legal writings earlier in the piece. And this again is a classic Knop move, finding promise and heterodoxy in the unlikeliness of places, breathing freshness into seemingly dusty corners of doctrine, practice, and scholarship without letting anyone off the hook. At one point in the piece, Karen writes, "Why should there be a single sovereign order coterminous with the state? Why not have overlapping sovereignties, fragmented sovereignties, layered sovereignties?" A page later, she quotes Kathleen B. Jones as follows: "We can replace the voice of the sovereign master, not with babble, but with efforts to recognize and admit responsibility for patterns of relationships that sovereign boundaries aim to negate." And I think there's so much in those two quotes about the concerns that Karen would pursue throughout her work on cities, and more recently, her work on foreign relations laws. Interest in overlapping legal orders, in multivocality and multivalence, but never in babble. There was a crispness, a kind of cool elegance to her writing and thinking. There was nothing woolly or overdone. Also, I think these two quotes are suggestive of the many overlapping layers and circles in which she worked as a scholar, of her scholarly life. She was the most gifted and extraordinary editor and an incredibly generous mentor, as many of you know, you all know, I'm sure. And as Aeyal has already said, a brilliant scholar and teacher. She was a creator of new initiatives. She was really the key person who shaped Aeyal Unbound as its first managing editor. But she never sought accolades or recognition. So much of this was behind the scenes. And another kind of layer or circle in which she worked was as a cultural observer. She had that razor sharp insight and humor, and she noticed things. She seemed to know so much about everything. I remember her telling me that the actors in black and white silent movies wore yellow lipstick. And it's exactly the kind of random cultural factoid that's kind of intriguing that Karen delighted in.
Someone is not on mute. Sorry.
She was hilarious on Angela Merkel and on famous international lawyers' forays into fiction. She once told me she wanted to teach a course on the novels, bad novels written by international lawyers. Again, that's typical of that deliciously acerbic humor that was never unkind. She never punched down, but she delighted in the kind of absurdity of humans and the worlds we make. She had an incredible generosity and unpretentiousness, which comes through in the way that she deals with scholars in this 1993 piece, the sense that she could talk with anyone, and she would typically talk with anyone at a conference, with a great sense of what might be of interest to them. She had an egalitarian and in many ways an openness, but she combined that warmth with a coolness, always keeping something of herself in reserve that made her fascinating. She was a very private person, I always thought, and she was, of course, private in the final rapid decline in her illness. I'm really grateful for having known some of the circles of Karen, although I wouldn't claim to know all. And I'm grateful that we still have her writings, like this 1993 piece, to read and think with, and just as importantly, her model of how to live a scholarly life well and a collegial life well. A life that was, like the final line of this 1993 article, one of, quote, the abstract anchored in the concrete, the real transformed by the imagination. Thanks again, Aeyal, and I look forward to hearing everyone's remarks.
Thank you so much, Fleur, for those moving words. And we're going to move to Rob Howse now. Hi, Robert.
Thanks very much, Aeyal. It's indeed a great honor to be able to participate in this appreciation of the scholarship of Karen Knop. I first encountered Karen at the beginning of my teaching career, which was at the University of Toronto, and I was pressed into service to be on Karen's dissertation committee, which very quickly made me rather uncomfortable. First of all, because I didn't have a PhD myself, like many academics in North American law schools. But second, because it became immediately apparent to me that although she was engaged in the exercise of doing a doctorate, she was really already, in many respects, a mature or highly developed original thinker. So there was something awkward about the supervisory pretension, but we soon worked around that and had, over the course of several years, the most intense and I would say fruitful dialogue day by day on issues of self-determination, secession, recognition in international law. So I'm not going to actually talk about the piece that I promised to talk about, because when I went back and looked at that piece, it seemed to me that it would be much more illuminating to return to the book that emerged in much different form and quite a bit later from Karen's dissertation, Diversity and Self-Determination in International Law. And it's very appropriate that I follow on Fleur's, because her essay, review essay of that book, is itself a striking and original piece of scholarship, where she sets Karen's book alongside Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. And so what is so penetrating and original in this book? Well, to begin with, and Fleur has already said that Karen was very polite to the academy as it existed. It becomes very apparent that throughout the book that Karen has seen through the illusions and self-deceptions of virtually every international law scholar who has tried to elaborate some kind of doctrine about self-determination. And in brief, and that this I think goes to the fruitfulness, Fleurs, of your Nietzsche setting alongside. It's because Karen, grasped from the outset, and you see this right in the introduction to the book, the dependency, in fact, fundamental dependency of the idea of self-determination in international law, not just on non-international legal sources, but on non-legal normative sources. And so she starts to, make us recognize from the get-go that international law as law doesn't define what is a people. And since the people is necessarily the subject of the right of self-determination, we would then have to ask how peoplehood is constructed in order to make sufficiently concrete or bestimmt the norm of self determination. And then we get into very complicated territory, because often the way that peoplehood is constructed is at odds with what is frequently understood to be the liberating potential of the idea of self-determination, since international law has, in some sense, unthinkingly, perhaps out of a notion that it's not importing very thick normative material, but rather accepting certain social facts, conceptions of peoplehood that are exclusionary and in their own way oppressive in terms of other identities, people-based identities, gender, and so forth. So all this means that if one has, in some sense, if one wants to be self-conscious and rigorous, reconstruct the idea of self-determination as an international legal norm from the get-go, or perhaps get rid of it and instead, play with, for example, as Karen discusses in such an illuminating way, and they were very good friends, Tom Frank's idea of a right to democracy or a right to democratic community. But and here again, I'm in some sense simply following Fleur's insights in that review essay. It seems to me that where Karen hit the sort of bedrock in her presentation of self-determination as being kind of perhaps the deepest examination of such comprehensiveness that exists, is really in that, in some sense, if one really thinks it through, the idea of a people is a derivative notion in itself. It derives from the idea of a collective of persons, and therefore, ultimately, if we don't have a compelling or persuasive conception of individual self-determination, in some sense, the norm of self-determination itself rests on, if not a shaky, let's say an obscure a foundation. And of course, and again, I'm continue to be struck by the Nietzsche setting alongside idea. Nietzsche's own way of looking at self-determination points in two different, opposite, and each of them disconcerting directions. One is heroic individualism or self-making, and the other is a kind of romantic reconstruction, mythological reconstruction of European territory and space that points to perhaps some very awful neo-colonial or colonial and oppressive possibilities. Of course, Karen's work doesn't resolve these difficulties, and she did not reconstruct the norm of self-determination in light of these, in many ways devastating insights. But anyone who wants to be self-conscious or to use that norm or invoke it in full self-consciousness cannot avoid these devastating insights. And I often in my early years of teaching tried to enlist Karen to become more of a public intellectual, to get involved in the debates about secession, Quebec secession and self-determination in Canada, the constitutional crises of the late 80s and early 90s. And she really quite resisted that. And I think that goes to this idea of her privateness, that she held to consistently through her life, and that's the reason why those of us who are here, who got to know her personally, had a unique opportunity to engage with her understanding and her depth, and also a bit here. I'll stop with Nietzsche and mention Walter Benjamin. Her fascination with all of the surfaces and appearances of human things, which was really extraordinary and went hand in hand with the depths of her insights into, in a way, the foundationless nature of international law that has always provided an opening, both for, unfortunately, illegitimate power and irresponsible fantasies. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. And we are going to move now to, as I said in the beginning in the program, to Robert Y. So from Robert to Robert.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Fleur. Thanks to Aeyal for arranging and including me in this event to remember and celebrate Karen, and to all the good friends, colleagues, and admirers of Karen who gathered today to remember her. Like so many, I'm still trying to come to terms with Karen not being with us. Last September, it was a shock. And when I spoke about Karen at another memorial event in November, I could barely get out comments for the shock of it all. I was struck then, like so many, with vivid recollections of her personal charisma and particularity. Every moment with her, even a minute with her, felt special. And Fleur and Rob have mentioned this kind of incredible combination of wit and irreverence, amusement, with huge interest in substance. And it would just be, you would jump from one to the other in a moment. Now, having a few more months passed, that I still recall that, but reading the work makes me think that actually the work, including this piece about Lorimer, captures some of that. She was very private, but in her written material, it is distinctive. It is so like her. It's so carefully constructed. It's so artistically combined with substantive insights. As Fleur mentioned, she was a brilliant editor, and she was a brilliant self-editor. I mean, she just took care with every word. And that was in every presentation and in every written text. So part of this idea here is that this reading this text, like reading many of her texts, has provided a bit of a comfort. Karen lives on. The afterlife of this scholar is there, both in substance, but also I think in a little bit the tone, the aesthetics of her work. So that's one thought. So I've been asked to say something a little bit about some of her work on private international law, and that's not that difficult because it's one of the contexts in which one encounters Karen as this genius, this creative mind, containing multitudes, moving across fields, intermingling high and low. Her move later in her career, but for many years, into private international law and transnational law really does capture that. One of my first encounters with Karen about her particular genius on this particular topic was we were coming out of some session on transnational law. It was maybe a transnational law workshop in Toronto. We're all into transnational law. And it was a particularly egregious session. And she came out and said to me, yes, it reminded me of this description of the Mitford sisters in a biography of history. And what she said was the Mitford sisters were referred to as barking, right? Now, I don't know the Mitford sisters, Fleur and others who are much more sophisticated, and Karen know much more about the Mitfords, but I can't tell the Mitfords from like a St. Bernard's. But even the precise intonation she used in deploying barking, if you've met her, was pitch perfect. I don't usually lose it, but her account in turn generated an out loud snorting that was a kind of barking in the context that was embarrassing in a transnational kind of way. In any event, what about more substantively in the written work, and in particular, the Lorimer piece that was published in the European Journal of International Law? I think what you see here is something that she really did remarkably in the private international law field, which is that she came to the field with an incredible grounding in other aspects of international law, and specifically public international law. The result was that leading figures in the field, like Horatio Miroir or Ralph Michaels, immediately recognized that this is somebody who had an incredible grounding in the broader field, but the smarts and the creativity to bring something to this further field. She often combined insights of public and private, and the Lorimer article is a good example of that. And that was often to the benefit of both sides of the disciplinary divide. An example of that was really personal. She's like one of the few who had any idea of what I was trying to do in my early work on private international law. And she actually explained it back to me and explained it to others better than I ever was able to explain it. So I guess that shows some ability with private international law, that she can make sense out of my own work. What about this particular piece? I would say there are three interesting, just general characteristics about this piece that you probably noticed right throughout, and I'll say something about each of those, and then I'll talk a little bit about the substance of the piece. First, Fleur's already referred to this. Karen is an incredibly careful reader and a very generous reader of texts, of those of her contemporaries and those of the past. And here in reading Lorimer, she's engaged in a kind of recovery and appreciation for some aspects of Lorimer's work that are entirely overlooked. At an event like this and at other things that are going to be held as Festschrifts, if you've read any of Karen's works that come out of Festschrifts, she was a total genius of this format. There's a review of her predecessor in public international law, a Canadian international lawyer called Ronald St. John MacDonald, which is a totally brilliant comparison and both admiring and kind of witty of St. John MacDonald's international law doctrine and contemporary science fiction of the time. So it was a kind of really wonderful piece. So it's a little hard to talk about somebody who's that brilliant about talking about others. But in this Lorimer piece, I think you see an example of that. This leads to a second preliminary point. One of the characteristics of her careful and creative read is her unrelenting, critical, and original approach. So she doesn't read Lorimer in the obvious way. Lorimer, to the extent he's not Grotius or Savigny, right? I mean, he's a leading Scottish international lawyer of the late 19th century. but he's not a major figure. In fact, he figures prominently for one reason, which is that he's one of the leading sources of this odious classification between civilized, barbarian, and savage societies, which was so characteristic of late 19th century international law. This has provided a ready target for critiques about the imperialism of traditional international law and contemporary international law. Karen acknowledges all that, but she actually reads Lorimer's Institutes, the book that contains that, for another classification system that she thinks is as interesting and as revealing. And that's these different ideas about citizenship that are found in that book. And this article is that recovery in a way that nobody would have gone into Lorimer and read for that. They would have all been struck by the obvious point. Her point was, no, let's do there's more critical and interesting things to be found in this material. I'm going to look at that. Third preliminary point, her careful reading and her critical eye extends to the object of recovery. And so in the same piece, and especially in the later sections, you see her incredibly aware of both the virtues, but also the darker sides of that particular approach to citizenship that she in some ways applauds in recovering it from Lorimer's Institutes. And I'll say something about that in a sec. So what is this particular reading? Those of you who remember this piece, and those of you who heard her present it, I guess, including in Tel Aviv, will recall that she identifies in Lorimer's text a kind of consciousness of different forms such as citizenship. And she identifies three. One is the public citizen, the classic public citizen of the state, and also of public international law. The basic idea is you're a member of that sovereign state, and that really is the central aspect in relation into which you're assessed. But she also identifies in Lorimer's writings a kind of consciousness that comes at that particular time of two other kinds of citizenship. One is as a citizen of humanity, a sense of the human as human, beyond a citizen of any particular nation state. And the idea here is that in some contexts, for example, prisoners of war, there were rights and obligations of individuals as citizens of humanity that were owed, that went beyond their alliance or allegiance or identification with a particular nation state. This is grounded in natural law, and it has many links to the recovery and later traditions of public international law, such as the international human rights tradition. So she articulates that as being in Lorimer as well. Third, and most interesting for private international lawyers, is she describes this category, the title of the article, of the private citizen of the world. And the basic idea here is these are not natural, just simply natural law obligations or rights of humans as humans, but actually related to the practice and the modes of engagement of civil society of the time, which was that individuals did straddle national frontiers, and they were also subjects of the national laws from which they originated. And part of this idea is a significant part of that was private law. And what Karen articulated in Lorimer was this notion that this is a distinct kind of citizenship. And the nature of this citizenship as recognized in international law was somewhere in between the public citizen of the state and the citizen of humanity. And it was not a minor category, it was a major category. It captured many of the categories of contract, of commercial relations, of family relations, of travel, of mobility. And part of her idea here was that Lorimer was a precursor of this particular element of the global citizenship that he recognized in 1883, and that needed to be, and still had not been fully processed by international law in the time when she's writing. So part of this idea here is that this overlooked vision of private citizen of the world added to our sense of what could be possible for citizenship theory now. And in particular, she saw in private international law approaches to citizenship a different approach, one that, for example, could be a little bit more flexible and more attuned to the realities of mobile individuals and groups. She describes how Lorimer was attached to the idea of domicile, a kind of more fluid and very private international law conception of belonging, which was not simply nationality, but was connected to multiple factors, including parties' choices about their location and residence. And so part of the notion here was that private international law contained within it ideas about legally based citizenship that were, in some sense, more varied and could be open to more forms of belonging than either the public state citizen or the citizen of humanity. She explored this a lot in her own work. A brilliant piece with Rolf Michels and Annelies Riles explored how using conflict of laws and private international law principles could help get around some seemingly impossible problems of multiculturalism and feminism. And in particular, they provided nice examples of how conflict of laws provided ways of cutting, of mixing, and of taking a kind of middle road approach to concrete problems that would, in some sense and in some contexts, be more valuable than either the more holistic, unified conception of the public citizen or the citizen of humanity. Last point. The last part of this article is stunning. Section 5 of the article is where she turns her critical lens on this claim that she's just made, that private international law and the citizen of the world frame might be productive. And what she does is in Lorimer itself, and then through an analogy to contemporary conditions, she identifies possible dark sides to this private law approach. She traces how Lorimer, in his discussion of Schleswig-Holstein, describes how German nationals and German individuals could, through their private choice, develop many connections and presences in the then Danish territory that was part of Denmark. And he, in his openness to the private side, permits private ordering to potentially change the facts on the ground so significantly that public international law might have to adapt. So his ideas about recognition and sovereignty might lead to a kind of extension through private ordering of what might look very much like the basis for annexation or for intervention by foreign sovereigns. And she identifies that as very much part of this turn to greater private flexibility. She doesn't stop there, though. She draws the connection then to the critiques that are very present now about the extension of private ordering in the corporate and commercial domain. And the basic idea here is the Republic of Chevron within the sovereign state of Nigeria, or the Republic, or the sovereign of Meta in the virtual world, are species of this darker side of the private citizen of the world. And she elaborates on that in a kind of beautiful section 5. So part of the idea I think about this article is it captures very well this way in which her close and critical reading operated in all these different dimensions, and they reveal things that are so helpful to folks who didn't think that there could possibly be anything of interest in a text as compromised as Lorimer's. Last comment. One of the attractions about Karen's Citizen of the World frame for me, and this has become actually the title of the symposium that's being held at the U of T in the fall, is that she was contributing to this kind of way in which it could build the best out of both public and private. And I think that project was still very much in the works. And one of the things that is most inspiring, I guess, was the sense that you thought that of all things, this would be exactly the person to do that. Somebody who was so well trained and well versed in all these areas, so careful and disciplined in her own thinking and of her own work, but also so warm and so generous and so attracted to all the different dimensions of the world. And in some sense, that part of it is what, to me, Karen's legacy is partly that, just a kind of inspiration at both personal and scholarly levels about this way in which you could be a citizen of the world in the best sense. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robert, for those words, which I think I really described it so well. And we are going to go now to Kerry Rittich, our last designated speaker, who from University of Toronto Law School, who has been a colleague at the University of Toronto Law School of Karen for many years. Kerry, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you, Aeyal, and thank you. I want to reiterate just thanks that you've convened this this workshop in Karen's memory, which is in some senses a virtual echo of where Karen herself lived much of her life. My apologies for joining all of you late. Aeyal had asked me to reflect a little bit on Karen as a colleague. And at this point, I think I'm going to just add a few footnotes to the observations that people have already made, but a remarkably consistent and compelling picture of Karen has emerged, and one that I can't really refute in any way. It's still tremendously unreal for all of us in Toronto to imagine that she isn't with us. The experience of walking by her empty office, which is now adorned with a picture of her and flowers, evokes something frozen in time that I feel the need to resist. So I actually continue in many ways to think of her and speak of her, sometimes even in the present. So, I mean, I think the first thing that has to be noted is simply that Karen, as a colleague, was a completely unique, original, and unrepeatable personality at the level of intellect, style, engagement. She was, without a doubt, one of the most distinctive persons in the law school community. She was immensely important to its culture and style in ways that I think we'll only continue to experience in the coming years. Whether it was something very serious or the design of the furniture in the faculty lounge, Karen would have something compelling and original to say. She was just a font of wit, irreverence, amusement, but of course combined with immense seriousness on things that mattered. I'm certainly not giving away any secrets to say that I think her professional and her intellectual life were at the center of her life. As with many of us, her personal relationships were often intermixed with work. Some of the people that she valued the most, the time that she's valued the most, I'm sure is inextricably connected with all of the things that everyone, Fleur, Robert, and Rob have already spoken about. Apart from just her completely irreplaceable and irreducible personality, I guess what strikes me, or what I would feel compelled to note about Karen, is how completely professional she was in any task, any responsibility that she undertook, whether it was preparing a class or delivering a talk or commenting on a draft. She was simply never unprepared, and she had extraordinarily high standards about what it meant to be prepared, standards that I think left many of us in the dust. As her husband Ralph confirms when we met him a couple of months ago, she worked as hard and as long as she thought was necessary to complete the task at the standard that she wanted it delivered. She often stayed up far into the night, for example, to prepare for class. Rob Howse gave a wonderful description of the depth of her intellectual ambition when he described the extent to which she drilled down to the bottom of questions, the legal questions, the foundational questions beneath the doctrine of self-determination. I think it's quite representative of what we all experienced of Karen as an intellectual colleague. I had an experience with her which most people didn't, which was sharing in the administration of the law school. I was the associate dean of the JD program when she was the associate dean for research. She made absolutely no claims to expertise or even liking administration at all. But I think it's not insignificant that she had an absolutely unparalleled 100% record at shepherding colleagues' grant applications to success, something unheard of at the time and that I'm sure will never be repeated. On the other hand, as everyone has suggested in so many ways, she was also one of the most fun people to be around, with a laugh that completely lit up the room. She had an incredibly offbeat sense of humor. And as we all experienced, any serious talk with Karen was very likely to be interspersed with references to fashion, to art exhibits, to something going on within popular culture, to the latest scandal or event, whether it was in the academy or in the political world. I think Rob said she had this ongoing fascination with the surfaces and appearance of things, but in a way that suggested that they mattered as much as substance. She had an incredible capacity, incredible fluidity at moving back and forth between the sacred and the profane, the serious and the trivial. I'll never forget the first time I had lunch with Karen after I was hired at the University of Toronto. She turned to me and said, "Do you know that Mamie Eisenhower's favorite color was pink?" And I was completely taken aback, but it put me on immediate record that this is somebody with a really distinct angle on the international. Karen also mixed friendship with intellectual engagement, as if the two were not just natural bedfellows, but inseparable. And I think this is true, notwithstanding the level of reserve and privacy which she also maintained. She was a famously beloved and effective teacher. She won a teaching award in her very first year. But any of her doctoral students can be approached to confirm that she approached supervision with immense insight, incredible attention to detail, extraordinary intellectual standards, and huge amounts of care and sympathy for her students and their progress. Like the rest of you, I never really imagined that my final conversation with Karen, one which characteristically was both trivial and profound, in the airport in Toronto last summer when we returned from Budapest teaching at the Institute for Global Law and Policy, would be the last one. I still carry the image of Karen in my head, that image from the airport. In fact, I continued to see Karen, I think, in the airport. Because she's so irreplaceable in her style and insights, there are a million things that I would love to speak to her about, knowing that she would have had completely distinct and unrepeatable insights, things that couldn't be found from anyone else. Maybe I'll just finish with circling back to what Robert has already adverted to, which is the title of the upcoming conference in Toronto that we will hold in September, Private Citizen of the World. Robert did a much better job that I could possibly imagine doing in describing what Karen did with that article. But I do just want to flag that the title of the article and its embrace as the title of the event that we're going to hold for her reflects, I think, the conception of personhood as well as citizenship that many people in Toronto think best represents Karen and the world that she would endorse. Both her privateness as a person, but the center of gravity of her scholarship in the last period of her life and work as well. I mean, as her very first articles on private international law describe, private international law rests on a conception of internationalism that is very different than the one that animates public international law, and it's a model that captures relational complexities that are elusive or simply unrepresentable in the state-based world of public international law. The idea that people have connections to people in communities other than those in the territories in which they find themselves, and that they engage in actions and projects routinely across borders. I guess put in a different way, she was alert to the fact that we're not reducible to our territorial affiliations, whether as citizens or intellectuals, and our projects and our preoccupations can't be reduced to them. The opposite is true. We act in so many other capacities. We have networks of affiliation that span borders and sometimes the globe. And although we're located in particular polities and have therefore numerous connections to those polities, their communities and concerns, as scholars, we don't always owe our central allegiance to them. Instead, we belong to transnational networks of scholars that operate in a distinct space. And for whatever reason, I feel like that separate space that's dedicated to critique, reflection, and exchange on the most fundamental questions in social and political life is what I remember of Karen and what I actually want to invoke right now.
Thank you so much, Kerry, for those moving words. And we do have some more time where we can do a few things. So first of all, if anyone would like to ask any of the speakers any question about the paper, about Karen's scholarship, we do have, this is also part of our teaching workshop. So we have our students who have read the papers and may want to ask question or say anything. So you're welcome to do so. And I know there are quite a few people also here who have known Karen and his work or engage with it. So if they would like to ask or comment or just say anything, we can open the floor for both kind of interventions. And maybe again, if any of our students would like to go first to ask any question about the papers that they read, or you have here great scholars who engage with this work, so you're welcome to do so, definitely. And again, anyone else can just use raise a hand function on the Zoom, and I know it's quite hard to follow on those, but if anyone would like to, or anyone that, yes, Lydia.
Hi, I don't know how to raise, lower hand. Okay, thank you so much for your really interesting introductions, and like you painted a really vivid picture of Karen and who she was. Something that came to my mind when I was listening, I think Professor Wei talked about it, her really distinctive skill of editing and self-editing. I was thinking maybe you can elaborate on this point and maybe give recommendations as to how Karen did this, and how like for young scholars who are in the beginning of their way, I find that it's quite difficult to self-criticize and self-edit, because I don't know, I sometimes fell in love in one of my ideas, and I get really into it, and self-criticism is quite hard. So maybe I would like to hear more about this. Thank you.
Robert, do you want to, or anyone else that's from wanted to expand on that?
I think I'd say only one thing, which is it connects to what Kerry actually alluded to. Karen just worked so hard on texts. That's her, and that was her own text or anybody else's text. And it helps that she knew so much and she'd read so much as well. But part of it was simply, I mean, she's sharp and just brilliant, but she was so devoted to the task that you put in the hours, right? And that was true when she's editing from everybody's accounts of it, Aeyal and down. But I had a grant application with her on foreign relations law, and the sheer amount of time that she spent me as a consequence on it as well was there. And I think those of you, there's a couple of Karen's brilliant doctoral students here as well, but she was like that as a supervisor as well. She was very, very generous with her time and very devoted to it. And in some sense, it was almost trying to inspire a kind of model of it. The techniques, I don't know. I mean, I don't have her genius editing techniques themselves, but she definitely would put incredibly devoted to putting in the task of editing her own and everybody else's materials.
Yes, and as you mentioned before, I mean, instead of in addition of being on the board of the American Journal of International Law, she was one of the, in the Aeyal Unbound, which was kind of a novel way of writing, in which she played a really major role in the launching and the development of this journal, which online companion of American Journal of International Law. But thank you, Rob, for those insights. If anyone else would like to ask anything, or anyone of Sandrine, yes.
Thank you very much for putting this this conference together and to make it virtual, because when we are actually far away. Sorry, my camera is a bit complicated. When we are actually far away from Toronto, it's not so easy to to actually participate to just remembering Karen, and it feels very frustrating. I'm currently in Belgium, where the internet normally works well. It's just my computer that is actually being very capricious today. But coming back on Lydia's question, I think at least from my point of view, what was really helpful with Karen comments. So just as a matter of context, I wasn't her doctoral students, but I spent 1 year of my doctoral years in Toronto, and Karen has greatly helped me. Has greatly helped me out with designing my research project, and also with writing the beginning of it. So what I think she was very good at doing, and what I'm trying to do now with my own students, is to engage with the work that she's actually reading, but without trying to control this work, without trying to make it the way she would have made it herself. And I don't think this is such a common ability that supervisors have, especially when they put so much energy into reviewing your work, right? Then you would think that maybe they want to see themselves in your work. And I think, as far as I am concerned, Karen never tried to do that with my work. And I guess this is part of why she truly, and my own PhD supervisor has always forgiven me for saying this out loud again and again, including at my PhD defense that happened in Paris last June, of which Karen was the president. So in Paris, Karen was just the one who actually enabled me to find out a topic that is worth, a proper PhD, a book, and everything, because she had this ability to give you energy, or to give you self-confidence, and also to give you her great intellectual insights without telling you what you should do with all this. So that's the only thing I wanted to say. Thank you for giving me the floor. Sorry for the camera, I think.
Thank you, Sandrine. And I think this are really themes that have been recurring here. Thus, whatever remembers of Karen is, right? Her intellect, her generosity, and the fun things, right? How much it was fun to be with her, and how much she liked having fun, and all the memories that you have from her are, I guess, combination of all of those three things. So I think if we don't have any more, we can draw it to the end, unless there's someone else who would like to say anything, and welcome to do so. And if so, let me know. It's a bit, I feel a bit of, I mean, I know there are quite a few other events, including the conference that will take place in Toronto. And of course, Karen's scholarship remains with us. But I have to say that ever since the news broke up of her death and we sought to plan this event, So I kind of feel a bit difficult almost ending in, because I feel, for those of us, at least here, which not be able in Toronto, it's kind of like, the kind of like sort of saying goodbye event in a way, which is very difficult to finish. So, but having said that, her work will stay with us, the memories will stay with us, and I'm sure.
Aeyal, you're muted for some reason.
Sorry, I don't know.
Your last 15 seconds.
Okay, so I said that that even though it's really a loss, it is, as Kerry said, it's very hard to discern and very hard to, and this gap and this lack will remain with us. We will, I guess, all try to fill us with the memories, and we continue to engage with Karen's work and with her, and the lessons we learned from her life, that what Robert described, this being a private citizen of the world. And I see Ian has his hand up, so Ian, please.
I'd just like to thank you for organizing this. It's been a great memorial to a wonderful woman.
Sure. And I'm reading what Natalie also saying. Grania, grants for organizing it. It was lovely event. Thanks, Grania, and thanks for everyone. I'm not reading everything in the chat, but because by the way, this workshop is convinced by Natalie and Eliav together with me, Eliav, Lieblich, and Natalie Davidson. So thank you for your cooperation, and thanks, Grania, for the great kind word in joining us, and Robert. Unfortunately, I don't think I can be there in September, but in Toronto. But we'll look forward to. I don't know if you'll record it or document it in any way, and we'll look forward to hear about this event.
I thought it was going to be on Zoom as well, that there's a virtual, a possibility of virtual participation
Okay.
for Toronto. Anyhow, I'm not sure, but
Well,
I thought they were.
I'm sure we'll get updated from the Toronto people about that. And by the way, this event has been recorded, and we will, make. Thank you, Ralph and Katrina, also for your comments. We will make the recording available later, so you can also share it for people. I know there's a few people who expressed interest who could not be here, so we are going to also share it for people who could not be here. So once again, thank you all for joining, and we will continue to carry on those memories and the engagement with Karen's work, I'm sure. And thanks especially for our speakers who all spoke so movingly, and I think described Karen and her work so accurately. So thank you, and we will, I guess, end the event now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thanks to all our students for being here through this term. Thank you, Fleur. Thanks for staying up so late, and thanks, Lavinia. And thanks, Paul, for joining us. See you there, Paul Ranke.